Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've given enough time now for people to join the session. My name is Andrew Mould. I'm Chief of the Regional Integration and AFCFTA Cluster at the Economic Commission for Africa's regional office here in Kigali in Rwanda. Welcome, everybody. It's a big shame that we're not actually meeting everybody in person here in Kigali. That was the original intention, to hold the conference here in Kigali, but I think the decision was made as we were coming out of the pandemic that it would be better to continue with the online version of the conference. Hopefully in a future event, we'll be able to actually meet in person. So I'd like to welcome all the participants. Let me quickly go through the papers we're going to be looking at in this session. The title of this particular session is quite generically Trade in Africa, and we got an interesting range of topics here. So the first, well, let me do it in reverse order actually, and then we'll come straight into that presentation. So the final paper is going to be on trade policy and Africa participation in global value chains. Does trade facilitation matter? And that's going to be presented by Moukaila Takpara, who I believe is yet to join us, but hopefully will join us in the next hour. There's the penultimate paper is going to be an empirical assessment of the role of trade in services and export diversification in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the presenter will be Bouraima Sawadogo. Would you like to just introduce yourself a little bit? Perhaps we could do a very short presentation of the speakers. You're based in Yaoundé, is that correct?
Yes, actually, I'm Yaoundé, and also I'm a PhD candidate actually in Pan-African University, which is hosted within the University of Yaoundé too. Okay, great. Yes.
Yeah, nice, pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to listening to your paper. The second presentation today is entitled Institutions and Intra-Sub-Regional Trade, the ECOWAS Case, and that is going to be presented by David Fadiran. David, would you like to just quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm David. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, as a research fellow within the Policy Research in Services and Manufacturing at University of Cape Town.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And then finally, the first paper is going to be presented by a colleague from East Africa, who I know very well, Socrates Majune, and the title of the paper is a macro and micro analysis of value chain trade in Africa. So you can see there's a continuity there in terms of value chains loom quite large in the analysis that we're going to be discussing here in this session. Socrates, if you could just say a few words of introduction. I know you're not currently in Nairobi, you're currently in Geneva. Perhaps if you'd just make a few welcoming remarks.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone from, good afternoon, everyone from Geneva. I'm currently here as a young professional at the World Trade Organization, but I am a PhD candidate at the University of Nairobi, where I also teach at the Department of Economics. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Now, I've noticed in another session I just attended that people have been quite strict in terms of the amount of time allotted to the presentations. So in principle, it's 20 minutes. Please try to stay within those 20 minutes. If you can do it quicker than that, probably better. We'll get more feedback and discussion. Participants are welcome to use the chat box for raising questions as well, or they can wait till the end of the presentation and address the question, ask their questions then. Okay, so I think with that, perhaps Socrates, we could go straight into your presentation. Would you be able to share your screen, please?
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Kindly confirm whether you are seeing my screen.
We can indeed, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. So once again, thank you very much and welcome to this presentation. I am working on a macro and micro analysis of the value chain trade in Africa, which is joint work with Angela Faith Montefalcon of the World Bank, and then Nathanael Nigatu, also the World Bank. As usual, I'd like to give a disclaimer that the views here do not represent either the World Trade Organization or the views of the World Bank. So, on to the key motivation of this paper is that there has been a lot of talk about the importance of GVC in economies, and this discussion has been rising especially since the 1990s. But the key challenge is the description of GVCs, especially in Africa, is quite scanty, or rather is not covered quite adequately. So what we do in this study is that we systematically compare Africa's GVC participation using both micro and also macro data. So in this case, we look at what the World Bank Enterprise Survey says, which is a micro data set. We also compare it with the UNCTAD EORA, which is a macro database. And then we also have access to customs data for Kenya and Uganda, which is micro based. So we compare. And then the next thing is we then ask ourselves, what are some of the factors that determine GVC participation in Africa? And with that, we follow the 2020 World Bank's World Development Report. So the key contributions that we have in this paper is that first, we systematically compare Africa's GVC engagement. Then we also construct 2 farm-level backward GVC measures for Africa. And then thirdly, we discuss the different empirical results based on the 3 sets of data. So one of the key things I would like you to remember from this presentation, just in case we don't get a lot of time to explain our results clearly, is that number 1, the aggregate GVC data masks disparities as Africa's portion of GVC farms is comparable to other regions, though the level of Africa's GVC trade is indeed much lower. The other thing is that a higher share of foreign-owned farms are not backward GVC farms in Africa, which could be because of the high resource nature of economies. Thirdly, we established that at a macro level, rather multi-country empirical results, they reveal that political stability influences GVC participation in African economies. But then when you look at farm level data, and specifically for Kenya and Uganda, which is single country analysis, we find that FDI is the most important factor. So in order to shape political stability and FDI seem to be the key driving forces of GVCs in Africa. And then as a policy is that preferably the African Continental Free Trade Area secretariats may consider establishing a protocol in the database that helps to understand Africa's GVC participation and more coherently to enable policymakers to make informed decisions. So allow me to purely just briefly describe some of the strengths and the weaknesses of our data sources. So here, for macro data, the UNCTAD EORA, the key strength is that it covers a wide range of countries. A good number of them are actually also African countries. It also covers backward and forward GVCs. Part of the weakness is that it's mainly inferred and mainly estimated in terms of how it's constructed, which might affect the final output. At the micro level, World Bank Enterprise Survey data, key strength is that it also wide in terms of coverage, it also consistent across countries, and it gives the farm level dynamics. The main weakness is that it is not actually designed for GVC study, and it only covers backward GVC participation and is not time consistent, especially across countries. That's why you realize when we come to our results, we'll mainly be talking about backward GVC instead of actually forward because of this limitation from the World Bank Enterprise Survey. And then lastly, customs data has a strength of actually giving more information about the specific products that are traded. It's also in terms of high frequency. The key problem is actually accessing the data. So in this case, we're only lucky to access farm level customs data for Kenya, but then we have country level customs data for Uganda. So this is how our data looks in terms of the period. So all the data sets, 2020 ending in 2020, except the EORA data, which ends in 2019. And then this is the number of countries that are there. Then allow me to also go through our definition of our GVCs. Once again, as you know, we have macro and micro data. So from the macro front, using the EORA data, we define GVCs as purely the ratio of foreign value addition plus the indirect value addition divided by the exports. And then at the micro level, following the World Bank Enterprise Survey, from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, specifically following this paper by Van Beers, Borek, and Mensa, a GVC farm is a dummy where one is a farm that exports directly or indirectly and imports inputs and supplies, and then zero otherwise. When you come to the customs data, our definition is that a GVC farm is a farm that exports and imports intermediate products at the same time or rather simultaneously. And then one which is a non-GVC is that one which exclusively imports or exports. So let's present a few results just to give you a picture of how GVC participation is in Africa, which is in line with our first objective, which was to purely map GVC participation. So from this graph here, we compare the backward GVC at farm level using the World Bank Enterprise Survey. So we compare for Africa, Asia, Europe, and also South America. We find that Africa not necessarily does not have the lowest share of GVC farms. We see that especially if you compare the percentage with the Asia, they are almost the same, which is about 15% there, the highest end. But then it's a bit different when you look at South America and Europe, whose GVC, the percentage of GVC participants is about 30%. When we look at the, compare now the backward and forward, and then the sum of the two, forward and backward, we see that a lot of the GVC in Africa is actually at the forward level, this blue line here, and then backward GVC participation in Africa has remained almost constant across time, yet it's actually the lowest in terms of the shares. This is quite different from Asia, where GVC, forward GVC, backward GVC participation is still least, but it has shown some slight improvements across time. The same also with forward GVC. With Europe, we see a different case where we have backward GVC participation being higher than the forward GVC participation. And then South America also has backward GVC being the least. When we look at just two countries, remember I said we have access to customs data for Kenya and Uganda. So we see that backward GVC participation is still low, is still the lowest among the two countries, with a slight improvement on Kenya's side as opposed to on Uganda's side as opposed to Kenya's side, which has fluctuated. And then if we compare now at the farm level, we found that number of farms that participate in GVCs from the World Bank Enterprise Survey are almost double those number of farms that participate from the Ugandan side. And then when we introduce customs data, we find that the number of GVC farms, when you look at, and the GVC farms that export are on average around 20%, and then those that import are on average around 60%, which is mapping almost the same thing that the enterprise survey data is telling us, that GVC participation among exporters in Kenya is about 60%. That's what we are seeing. We also look at it in terms of ownership. So we find that unlike other continents, foreign-owned farms are more likely to be non-GVC farms in Africa, as opposed to these other continents. This purely means that a lot of the foreign-owned farms in Africa are actually not participating in GVCs, and it could possibly be one of the things that policymakers will start thinking of at this initial stage. So very quickly, let's look at now the empirical side, where we now ask ourselves what exactly are the determinants that, what are the factors that determine GVC participation in Africa? So this equation 5 is for a country level analysis. And then for farm level analysis is equation 6. You can see that for the farm level analysis, we also include product fixed effects. We also include destination fixed effects, or rather the country fixed effects, and then also the time fixed effects here. That's what we are having. And the key variables here are indicators of endowment, market size, geography, and institutions, which follow the 2020 World Development Report. So in the next slide, you'll be seeing the key specifics. What do we represent by endowment and these other factors here. So when we come to empirical results, so this table here compares results from EORA and also the World Bank Enterprise Survey. And you can see down here the number of countries that were actually compared at the bottom of this table. So we have indicators such as FDI, stock of rent, and then the stock of land, and then capital stock. We have the amount of skill, and then the market size, which is measured by the value addition in economies. Then we have distance to main GVC hubs, and then political stability. So to cut the long story short, the only factor that we find to have an almost consistent story is this political stability, where we find that it actually has a positive effect on backward GVCs when we look at EORA data, and then it also has a positive effect on GVCs when we look at the World Bank Enterprise Survey data. But then for forward GVC, we find that political stability has a negative effect. But then when we look at this total GVC, which is the sum of the forward and the backward, we find that it has no significant effect, partly because of this difference in direction between backward and forward here. So the other thing is we then interact Africa with these specific variables to just assess the effect, compare the results for Africa versus other regions. Once again, we have a lot of inconsistencies in terms of as we move across the databases. But when we look at this, when we look at political stability, we find an almost similar story with this previous table. So that in short says that, sorry, it is not possible to draw a consistent story for many of these explanatory variables, except for one. And mainly because we find that political stability has a positive effect on backward GVC participation. Yes, please.
No, it's okay, Socrates. I think the connection's back. It's our side. It's my side. Yeah, okay. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So mainly because we find that political stability has a positive effect on backward GVC of African countries, according to the multi-country empirical results, that is using these two databases. And then the effect of other factors of a multi-country analysis actually is purely regular across the databases. So we then compare this at farm level. Here we have the same variables. We have FDI, the level of skill in these countries, capital stock, market market size, political stability. And then one of the key consistent stories that we find here is this aspect of FDI, where we find that FDI has an almost consistent effect. So this first part is for Kenya and then the other one for Uganda. So this first equation here, we compare World Bank Enterprise Survey data, and then we use customs data for farm level for Kenya, and then we have EORA. And then we also do the customs data, but at the country level instead of farm specific, and then we find it's almost positive across all types of databases. For Uganda, we only have country level access customs data, but not the farm level. So we also repeat the same procedure. But then we find a consistent story that FDI actually has a positive effect. As opposed to these other variables, we find that the signs and the level of significance actually differs across databases. So the next thing, here we purely just highlight what I've already said, that we find that FDI seems to have a consistent story when we look at the Kenya and Uganda's backward GVC participation as opposed to other factors. So in conclusion, we realize that our data actually masks some disparities, whereby we see that the percentage of African farms that participate in backward GVC is comparable with other regions, but the value of Africa's backward GVC is comparatively low. So the high share of foreign-owned farms are not backward GVC farms, so Africa may need to attract more export-oriented FDIs as part of the things policymakers can start thinking about. The other thing is multi-country empirical results, specifically from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, reveal that the common thing is that political stability explains backward GVCs in Africa. But then at farm level, we look at, we find that FDI being the key factor that actually drives GVC participation. That is when you look also at specific countries, Kenya and Uganda. So in conclusion, using the within-country comparison is the optimal way to access GVCs using macro and micro data helps to highlight these facts. And then African countries, preferably the FCFTA Secretariat, may consider establishing a protocol and database that helps understand Africa's GVC participation more coherently to enable policymakers to make informed decisions. And then the protocols should be standardized the way trade activities are registered, and those assumptions used in preparation of the national input-output tables. Thank you very much, and that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Socrates, and thank you for keeping within the time there. So colleagues, could I now open the floor to questions and observations? Is there anybody? Perhaps I could start off with a couple of preliminary observations. Socrates, I'm interested in this paper because we're presenting a similar paper where we're actually focusing really on the what determines the share of domestic value added versus foreign value added, more simply, rather than integration into the value chains per se. So we're presenting that on Friday. So I was interested in the paper. I think you have some good, you've done a lot of good work here, and it's nice that you've matched it up with the national data from Kenya and Uganda as well. I'm a little bit worried about the meaning of some of the data though that we're getting, the underlying data. So you cautioned, I think at the beginning, didn't you, about the imputed nature, for example, in the UNCTAD EORA database. I don't know if you could just go to your slide 7 again. Yes, I mean, look, yeah, the one before, I think it was. Socrates. 7. slide 7. Nope, no, not that one. 6, 7, next one. Oh, that wasn't the one I was meaning, actually. This one, yes, sorry, please stay there. Yes, that's not 7, is it? Yeah, I mean, it's just the stability. You know, if you look at the GVC participation percentage of exports, and you see that backward GVC and it's a flat line, and nearly all the other observation, the only thing that you can see where there's a variation maybe is the global financial crisis and the impact that that had on trade around 2008-9. Otherwise, everything's pretty flat, isn't it? And that's even true for other sub-regions. So I'm a bit confused by that. I mean, with Europe, you can see an increase in the tendency of forward global value chain up again to the global financial crisis, which flattens out. But that makes me a little bit worried about the economic sense of some of these numbers. And there was also something else I think you showed, the next slide, was it? No, so the previous one, actually, sorry. It was the previous one, yeah. So I was wondering what would explain, for example, the sharp decrease in global value chain participation between 2008 and 12 in Latin America, in South America, compared with the 2016-2020 period. That also seems, we also see some pattern of a sharp drop in Asia as well. And I am slightly perplexed by the finding that the comparisons between Africa and Asia are quite similar in terms of backward GVC participation. Perhaps you could just reflect a little bit on some of these patterns in the underlying, you know, descriptive data that you have there, because I'm sure probably other people working in this have similar concerns about, you know, the reliability of the underlying data and what it's actually telling us. I see there's another question there from, shall we take another question as well? David, would you like to intervene, please?
Yes, thank you, Socrates, for a good presentation. My question is a very simple one. I just want to find out, measuring political instability, what was your measure of it? Because oftentimes it's quite, especially when you take it into macro data, can be quite dirty in terms of it's telling you what's happened as opposed to it's impacted on something that was happening. But yes, what did you use to capture political instability?
Thank you, David. Has anybody else got any questions? Because if I may, Socrates, and I might come back with another observation. In your regression results, if you could just go to that slide as well. I mean, when you look at the World Bank Enterprise Survey data, and you compare that with the EORA database, I mean, David has a point there about the political stability being very significant. None of the other variables are significant. And then I just, you know, I know strictly speaking, the R squared you're not supposed to look at, but when it's 0.001, it means the model is explaining basically nothing in the variation of global value chain inclusion. No. So again, it's one of these things that makes me worry about the underlying data sets, really. And then the final observation there on this is you seem to, for example, have rather inconsistent results. Market size, for example, is significantly negatively related to backward global value chain integration, but positively related to forward. Now, in terms of parameter values, they're all quite small. And even the other significant one is land is relatively small compared to the political stability one. I presume that's some kind of dichotomous variable or just index. So David's question's pertinent there. But I just thought perhaps you could expand a little bit on how you interpret these results again, and what your own concerns may be in the underlying data sets.
Okay, thank you very much for those two questions. Of course, we agree with you with some of the concerns of some of these trends, and purely boil down to partly why we exactly thought of doing this study. So I honestly don't think might really have an exact explanation of why exactly, for instance, some of those trends have been happening like in South America, but purely to also agree with you, possibly there's need to look a little bit more into the data, and that's why we suggest for the African context, if we could have a more comprehensive database by the policymakers by the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, I think it would be better.
I think you'll find, Socrates, that they simply don't have the resources to take on an endeavor like that. You know, they have a lot of work just with the implementation of the AFCFTA currently in the negotiations. So I'm not sure collected data is something that they're really is within their mandate currently.
So our thinking is we of course will find a little bit more consistent results, especially if you use a database such as the customs data, which is sometimes quite tough to obtain. So possibly if the problem is accessing that data, or rather right now it might not be the biggest priority for the Secretariat, but if there could be an agreement or something with the revenue authorities of specific countries to assist in obtaining the data, then especially the customs data, possibly it will give us a better results on mapping GVCs. Then on to David's question on our measure of political stability. Is purely from the World Governance Indicators, World Governance Indicators database, and here we are more interested in whether they were cases of terrorism, whether they were cases of whether there was an absence of violence or terrorism, which are purely perceptions of the likelihood of political stability, or rather politically motivated violence. So that's how we measure the variable. Perhaps the thing that you could be trying to drive to, which I didn't really explain quite well, is how we go about handling this variable, since these databases also move different across time periods. So for this macro data, we were using more of a decade averages to as one of these independent variables. That's specifically for the EORA data. But then for the World Bank Enterprise Survey data, since it's not consistent over time, we were just using for the specific years. So in terms of the interpretation of the coefficient is just what we are seeing here, except for this results at the farm level. Since here the definition is the dependent variable, which is either a farm is a GVC or not, we analyze actually probit regressions. And then that's what we're interpreting in terms of the marginal effects are not presented here, but the main paper has the marginal effects of these probit regressions, and that's what we interpret. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Socrates. Thank you, David, also for the comments on the paper. If we may move now to the next presentation, and that will be yourself, David, Institutions and Intra-Sub-Regional Trade, the ECOWAS Case. David, over to you. Would you be able to share your screen as well with the presentation, please?
Can you all see my screen?
I think it's coming up now, yeah. Yes, indeed. Yep, so over to you, David.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to present here. So I'll be talking about this paper that I've worked on with another researcher at the University of Witwatersrand, Adiola Yanubi. And it's, I think mine should be quite short because I ask a very quick and a quick question. Hopefully I get some good comments. It's still a work in progress. So we're looking at institutions and how it impacts on intra-sub-regional trade, and using the ECOWAS region as our case study. And the reason we look at this is because there is a lot of excitement, a lot of research and just discourse on the potential for the AFCFTA and all that comes with it, especially as all the negotiations and countries try to present what it is that they want from the agreement, etc. But we also do know that there were quite a number of regional economic communities that were on the continent prior to the AFCFTA. And a lot of them had ambitions to progress further in terms of like the integration within that region or that sub-region over time. But for a lot of them, this never happened. And we have to ask why the progression not really occur, and even also ask why were the countries not, why was intra-trade between those regional or sub-regional communities not at the level that you would hope they would get to, given the kinds of agreements that were in place. And I'm asking this question from an institution's perspective in terms of we're looking at two countries, and we're looking at the nature of the quality of institutions within those two countries, and then asking the question, does it matter for the level of trade between these two countries? That's the simple question that I'm trying to ask here. So we are aware that institutions are been shown to have an important role in terms of economic outcomes. Been shown that institutions tend to have an important role to play in terms of the level of trade, overall trade. But then we want to ask a much more nuanced question in terms of, if you look at a certain region, does the difference in the quality of institutions between two trading partners, does it matter for how well they're able to transact or engage with each other? Especially when you think about the core definition of what institutions are, which is, you think about the rule of law and its ability to reduce the cost of transactions. So if I know that I can trust, or if I know that there's systems in place to protect whatever kind of contracts I have with this other person I'm trading with, then I'm much more willing to engage in transactions with this other individual. If I'm not so sure, that is, if I don't trust the quality of governance or the quality of institutions or contract laws within that other country, then I might not be as encouraged to transact with that other agent. And this is kind of the driving thinking behind the exercise that I'm trying to carry out here. So just a brief overview in terms of the states, and I don't need to go into detail about this because I think a lot of other studies that have been presented today have already looked at some of the state of intra-regional trade. So if you look at Africa in comparison to, say, Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Asian countries, Africa is one of the lower countries in terms of the amount of, if you look at the ratio of the total trade, the ratio of the total trade of the region that goes to other countries within the region as opposed to other countries outside of the region. So you'll find Europe is about 67%, whereas Africa is about 15%. And you know, and the idea is that if we bring in something such as the AFCFTA, after we cut out a lot of the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers and make things easier for countries to trade with each other, we are hoping that this would now drive these numbers up quite significantly. But you still have to ask yourself the questions: why have these countries not been able to drive these numbers up in spite of all the regional agreements that have been in place prior to the introduction of this AFCFTA. So with that being said, I have this graph in front of us, which is also just a descriptive. And looking at all the 15 ECOWAS countries we have, and then looking at the ratio of trade that goes between the specific ECOWAS country and other countries within the ECOWAS. And these numbers are not the exact percentages. The percentage is actually very, very small if you look at how much goes to other ECOWAS countries. But you're just looking at them and looking at how different countries compare to each other in terms of the ratio of the total trade that goes to ECOWAS, other ECOWAS member states. And you see that immediately Nigeria and Ivory Coast stand out outside of other countries. Benin, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, and other countries follow behind, but you see that in comparison to Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria, it's very small. And that makes sense. It's not very surprising because Nigeria is a major regional player in terms of the size of the country and its role within the trade within the region. And then if we look at these countries individually, sorry, the graph is a bit murky. I look at just about 8 of them, not all of them. We'll see that for a lot of the countries, the amount of trade that's going to other ECOWAS countries has been going up slowly but surely over the past 40, 50 years. There's quite a bit of fluctuation. We're looking at just exports, not imports here. And so if you look at Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, and Niger, they all have almost like an upward trend, even though there's a lot of volatility that you see there in terms of, say, for example, Nigeria. There's a high jump and there's a significant fall in 2011, and it's slowly going back up again. If you look at, I need to update this graph. If you look at Senegal, Ghana, and Guinea as well, we see that there's been a move, but for example, a country like Guinea has not really done much of growth in terms of its exports to other ECOWAS countries, but at least with Ghana and Senegal, you see significant moves, but it's also quite unstable in terms of their progress towards that desired outcome. And just a very quick brief about ECOWAS. So a country of 15, it's a regional community that contains 15 countries. It was established in 1975, but because of its failure to achieve some of the set objectives of establishment, they've had 2 other treaties that were signed after that time, in attempts to try and get countries to I guess, buy into the process of integration. But I think the key question that comes out from all of this is if previous regional agreements have not led to the expected outcomes, how do we expect that the AFCFTA is going to overcome those, whatever it is that was obstructing them from reaching those desired outcomes? And maybe the question we should be asking, in addition to all other questions that other researchers are asking, is what are some of the hindrances that's what some of the hindrances that's maybe standing in the way of countries achieving that objective. And I'm looking at institutions as possibly one of these, one possible way to look at it. And I mean, I guess I could look at the paper by Levchenko in 2007 that looks at international institutional comparative advantage. It's almost sort of like a theoretical framework to support this kind of question, where it finds that when you have just a marginal difference between 2 countries in terms of the quality of institutions in those 2 countries, then there's potential welfare gains to trading between each other in terms of differences in institutions. And also points out that if the country that has the higher quality institution might have better to gain from trading with the country that has the lower quality institution. So within that kind of scenario, there might be an incentive for countries to improve the quality of institutions, so they can potentially gain a bit more from trade. My question is not necessarily a test of this theory empirically. My question is looking at specifically how differences in the quality of institutions between two trading partners, how that matters for their level of trade within those two countries. And it's based on the idea that, if you're familiar with the paper by Glaser and them that look at, or even some of the newer research that's looking at political economy and institutions and informal institutions or social orders within countries. And the idea, the basic idea being that if you have, you can develop certain kinds of institutions, but the social orders in that country will impact on how the country, or how those institutions are affected in that country. So therefore, you might be able to have some kind of like equilibrium in a country, even though the country is not necessarily implementing the best type of institutions at that particular point in time. And taking on that, we now can say that is it possible that whether a country has, in quotes, good institutions or bad institutions, what matters is that there is a decent understanding of the nature of institutions between those two countries, and that can now impact on how much those two countries trade with each other. So take two countries, for example, take say Nigeria and Ghana. If Nigeria has maybe let's just assign it a score of institutional quality that's say around 10 and 7 out of 10, and Ghana has 5, they're relatively close, as opposed to if you look at say Nigeria and Ivory Coast, and Ivory Coast maybe has a quality of score of institutional quality that's around maybe 0, and the distance between them is almost 7 points, as opposed to 2 points with Ghana. Then the idea is, does the closeness of institutions or governance between Ghana and Nigeria help make it easier for the two of them to trade in comparison to a country like Ivory Coast that has a lower quality of institutions? That's
David, could I just encourage you, yes, to get to the results, because time is running out, so we won't have much time to discuss. Okay.
Yes, so I make use of the data that I used as the IMF DOTS data. I used some of the gravity variables from the CEPII, and then I use yes, issues of endogeneity do pop up because I'm looking at country levels. So I look at the initial gap between institutions, or difference between institutions, as my measure, as my instrument. And then as my estimation technique, I use a lasso or partially out regression method. And the reason I have to do this is because we're looking at country pairs as our panel units. And because of that, you have so many different panel units, and that can eat into your degrees of freedom. And what lasso and partially out does is it helps you to select only the variables that matter for the actual outcomes that you get. And let's get to the results. The results, under identification results, show that the instrumental variable that we use is good and works for us. And then the main results, which is this, is on the third column. We look at the gap between institutions, and we find that the higher the gap between institutions, the higher the gap in the quality of institutions between countries, the lower it is countries trade with each other. And then we have all these other variables that we control for, like contiguity, that is countries that are neighboring and that share borders with each other, distance, common language, and trade balance. And we find that the quality of institutions, at least the difference between the quality of institutions between two trading partners, does matter. And the higher that gap is, the lesser countries tend to trade with each other. And this result remains, and the interesting thing for me here is the fact that, yes, we see what we want to see, but we also see that in comparison to some of the other the variables that we would expect to play a significant role, like the common language, distance, contiguity, we find that the coefficient that's on the institutional gap tends to have a larger coefficient than the other. Yes, and then you want to ask the question that, well, you want to make sure that your results remain consistent even when you remove the major regional player like Nigeria from the data set. So we remove that, and we still run the same model, the same regression again, and the coefficient remains exactly the same. It doesn't really go away. It's still significant, and it has a significant negative impact as the quality of institutions or the gap between them increases. So those are my results, and yes, so we find that, and I think going forward, I think one of the things that I would like to explore is following on the work by Levchenko. Now look at the same question, but now drive it and look at this question at a sectoral or firm level. Between, say, maybe a much smaller group of countries, because it becomes quite cumbersome when you start looking at so many countries at the firm level. But I think that will be the next step. And then to use a better constructed measure of institutions, so we use the quality measure for quality of institutions. But it doesn't really properly give you, it doesn't properly unbundle the different sub variables of the institutional quality. There is a new measure that's been worked on by Gwen Hamill, Fedeki, and them, but it doesn't cover all ECOWAS countries yet. But they're still working on it. And as soon as that is available, we might be able to now carry out a test that looks at specific types of institutions and how they impact on, and how the difference between them impacts on the quality of, on the extent of exports from one country to the other across the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So we have about 5 minutes for questions from the floor. If nothing's forthcoming immediately, I've got a few questions myself, David. Thank you for that interesting contribution. Shall I kick things off? Yeah, okay. So I'm particularly interested in this paper, anything to do with continental integration and looking at how the performance of regional economic communities has fared up to now is always a very hot topic for me. And I think you've looked at it from an interesting angle on this issue of institutional gap. I'd like to first make an observation again about the descriptive statistics. I don't know if you could go back to some of your figures on trade, the ones at the beginning that you showed. Yeah, these figures actually. Yes.
This one?
Yes. No, not that one. The following ones. You say that you got it from IMF dots, the trade figures. They don't look right to me. So in the paper, you actually have it where the amounts are really quite trivial for, I believe, for Burkina Faso and Mali, is it? And then even the figures that you have for Nigeria, if these are annual trade figures, unless you're using monthly trade data. Otherwise, I think right. And I can't tell because of the way you've put it in the presentation. It's not like that in the paper. But when you put so many zeros, it becomes rather difficult to interpret, doesn't it? So you might want to just adjust the presentation, okay, for future use. But it looked like your figures were quite a way out. So, for example, Nigeria is exporting around 62 billion in 2019 in total globally. And I think around 9-10 billion of that is to the continent. And actually, Nigeria has a positive trade balance with the continent. But that's, of course, because of its oil exports. And I believe a lot of those oil exports are sent to Cote d'Ivoire for refining and then sent back. So there's a few complications in using the IMF dots numbers, and it can give a very distorted picture. Because one of the complaints about ECOWAS is it hasn't been very functional in trade terms. It's been much more, focused on the political and peace and security issues, but actually as an economic grouping, it's been rather disappointing. I think you might want to look again at those numbers and just look at least how you're presenting them and double check them in the regressions as well, of course, because they didn't look in the right ballpark to me. So that's the first point. If you could just go to the regression results very quickly as well, please, David. Because I find that very interesting, the last column. Yes. Now, your variable of institutional gap seems to be effectively negatively significant. What strikes me, which is, I think, very important for the ECOWAS region, is the resounding significance of common language. And it would seem to me that in West Africa, one of the main barriers to trade is the division of the bloc between the Francophone and Anglophone countries, where you'll have a Anglophone country like Ghana surrounded by Francophone countries and effectively not trading so much with them, Nigeria perhaps rather more. And there's probably an overlap between what you're trying to measure in terms of institutional gap and also the linguistical issue. Now, there's a very good paper by Melitz and Tubal from 2014 in the Journal of International Economics, where they actually suggest that you shouldn't classify countries as a common language just on the basic of one language, particularly in multilingual societies. And so for Hausa, for example, is a common denominator, isn't it, across much parts of West Africa. And that's quite an interesting paper, because when they start to split it up into lots of different languages which are often spoken on the African continent, they actually get even a stronger effective language. So I was just wondering if you had some reflections on that, on how the institutional gap might relate to linguistical barriers across West Africa. And with that, I'll close my comments. Does anybody from the floor wish to add anything or make some observations? No? If not, David, over to you.
Yes, thanks for the comments. Please say the name of the paper you're referring to again.
It's Melitz, Jack Melitz and Farid Tubal, Journal of International Economics. It's quite a widely cited paper because they suggest that a lot of the gravity modeling, when they're looking at, language being significant, they're suggesting that it's actually underestimates the importance of linguistical factors. And I can't think of a better region than West Africa for testing that kind of hypothesis, really. That's been one of the main barriers to ECOWAS, hasn't it? The division between Francophone and Anglophone countries.
Yes. So I completely agree with that. I do think West Africa is a very interesting conundrum in that sense, that you have Nigeria and Ghana. And I think like three, but they're all spotted between Francophone countries all across board. And that's probably also why you find that contiguity almost doesn't become significant here, which means like the fact that the shared borders is not as big a deal as the fact that they have a common language. And
yes, indeed, yes. That's not normally found in these studies, is it? No, actually, you normally get the continuity.
It's very, very significant in our studies, especially when you do spatial econometrics. And that's very interesting, but it's not surprising for West Africa or for ECOWAS. In terms of the data, it's always a problem, isn't it, when you look at I could make use of the IMF DOTS data is the one that gives you the country pair trading numbers, and I guess it makes it easy to work with. But if there are problems with it, I'll take a look at it again, and then maybe try a different data set and see if my results remain constant. Maybe that's what I should do, in line with what Socrates has done with this study, and just have maybe 2 or 3 different data sets and see if my results remain constant.
Yes, I mean, those descriptive figures don't look quite right to me. So I think you need to look at it. It might just be for the purposes of the tables, but you do want to verify that. UNCTAD stat is also a very tractable, easy to use data set for bilateral trade as well across the continent. So you could also look at that. I would also caution a little bit about Penn World tables being one of the sources. I don't know if you've seen the work by, is it Jervin Morton or Morton Jervin? I always get his name wrong. Who, that book that complains about the quality of a lot of macro statistics across the continent. And I think he's particularly critical with the Penn World table results, because the degree of correlation between those and what member states are often reporting is the largest for Penn World tables, I seem to remember, So you might also want to be careful of that in terms of when you look again at the regressions. Okay, so if there's no other comments from the floor, I think we can pass on to the next presentation. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
that's an interesting theme that you have there, definitely. Look forward to seeing the final paper. So now we turn to Bouraima Sawadogo, and the paper is entitled An Empirical Assessment of the Role of Trade in Services in Export Diversification in Sub-Saharan Africa. So Bouraima, would you like to go ahead, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Yashem, the chairman, for giving me the floor. My name is Bouraima Sawadogo. So I'll be the one presenting a paper with my colleagues, which is entitled The Empirical Assessment of the Role of Trade in Services in Export Diversification in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the outline, my presentation will basically start with the background of the problem, and also I will present the objective of the study, and also the methodology that has been used, and we present the result, which will be finalized with the conclusion policy recommendation. So, we are actually in the context where economic diversification is viewed as an important source of resilience to external shock of macroeconomic shock and development for low-income countries. And also diversification is a source of view as a source of economic growth, and also view as a source of structural transformation and sustainable development. The economic diversification means that an economy is productive. Productive structure is dispersed into a large number of activities that can, differ from one another, like goods and services produced according to Barthelemy. So we are actually in the situation where export diversification is still relevant in Sub-Saharan Africa countries, especially, and in the context where exports are still dominated by commodity, and also is a priority to the diversification, also the priority to the national, regional, and the international development agenda, such as the Agenda 2060 of African Union, and also the SDGs. So despite the downward trend in the export concentration index in Sub-Saharan Africa, during this year, the level is still high compared to the other region, like the North America, and also to Southern and East Asia, and also to South America. So, the world economy is meanwhile the world economy actually increasingly an economy characterized by the services economy that take an important portion of international trade. The services are now almost meanwhile invisible in the exploration, the determinant of economic diversification according to the UNCTAD and the WTO annual report of 2020. According to a WTO annual report of 2019, the services are now the largest and the most dynamic component of the both developed and the developing countries, that accounting for more than 60% of the global output, and also unemployment, and also even though it's account about 20% of total trade. The share of the developing economy in the world trade in commercial services is about 35% in 2017, according to the WTO 2018 report. So now, what is how can you? It's very important to know what is the services. According to Blanchlet and the Crystal, trading services is defined according to them as a transaction between resident and non-resident of an economy, and also the general agreement on trading services, classified trading services according to the mode of supply, which we have 4 mode of main mode of supply according to the that agreement. So the first one is that the cross-border supply, the abroad consumption, we have the commercial presence, and the fourth one is the presence of a natural person. So according to the Cateno and al. The 2010 and also the Su and al. In 2020, they defined the trading services with the by referencing the general agreement on trading services as all transactions in basic service, including mainly communication, financial intermediation. We have transportation. Meanwhile, the non-basic services are included most of the other categories of services. So we came to realize also that there is a really gap in the literature on the export diversification on trading services. Empirical and analytical study on diversification have long focused on the structure and dynamic on trade and on tangible goods. Meanwhile, and also empirical finding highlight also that diversification is determined by the various factors that influence the long-run behavior of export structure in the country and the region. But at the same time, the premise, the premise to work on the theoretical foundation on the contribution of services in the real activity, such as Adam Smith. We have also the Baumol and Fuchs. They had a pessimist view on the services. For them, services cannot be considered as really having a real impact on the real activities. But as Francois and Korkman had they figured out the majority of the research on the services focus more on liberalization in the services sector, as well as the literature gives more credit on the trade and FDI in services. At the same time, a study on the contribution on the international services flow to the world output and export pattern are even less visible. So our work is contributing, bringing now to the contribution as to the literature in many ways. The first one, the study intervene in the context where there is a need for empirical investigation on the relationship between the trading services and also the dynamics of export diversification. It also came to where the study, in the study, we studied the effect of the dimension of the trading services on export diversification, and that will allow us to have an holistic and specific view on the contribution of trading services in the export diversification. We also highlight the role of tourism sector into the export diversification in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the main objective of the studies of the paper is to identify the dimension of trading services that promote the export diversification in Sub-Saharan Africa. So to do that, we use the secondary data that collected from some database that we have the World Development Indicator. We have also the Penword table. We also the UNCTAD database where we collected the data of the trading services. So the data, we have a panel and balanced panel data that covering 48 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa over the period 1996 up to 2020. So the export diversification can be measured through a lot of indices that we find in the literature. So we have the Warehead Index, we have also the Entropy Index, we have also the Effindal Index, and as well as the Aggregate Specialization Index, and also the Export Ubiquity Index developed by Osman and Oldigado. So in this study, we just use the normalized Effindal-Ishman index to measure the degree of export concentration. And also this index is preferred because it is both the simplest one, but and also to program and also the most frequent use in the literature. And the model specification, we just use a simple linear model to specify the relationship between trading services and export diversification. So where we have the XCOM is capturing the export concentration, and also we have the TS, which is capturing the different dimensions of trading services. And also the X is capturing a set of the control variables. As a estimation strategy, we use we are having 48 countries that cover in the 25 years. So that's the number of countries larger than the so we can use the simple, like, ordinary least square with the fixed or random effect. But the literature show that use of this kind of estimator can also can give a biased result, like they're not accounting for the heterogeneity, and also cannot solve the problem of correlation. So therefore, we use the GMM method, which is the generalized method of moment. And that one is for many reasons. The first one, it is established empirical that we have a problem of homogeneity between our variable. So that method, that estimator can, help us to solve the problem of homogeneity between, the trade openness and also the abandonment of natural resources and trading services and diversification. And the fact also that they find we have like the dynamic character of our dependent variable that also explain also the use of the GMM. But the problem of to find some instrument to solve the homogeneity, we just use the lag of our interest variable. So as a result, we have like two kind of variables that are having an effect. Those are having positive effect, but with significant effect. We have like the total export in services. We have transport services, we have travel services, insurance services, financial services. We have also the use of license and intellectual property services and business services, as well as tourism export. Those are the variables that having positive and significant effect on export diversification. On the other hand, we have some variable like construction services, ICT services, and creative economy that are having positive effect but non-significant on the export diversification. So to check the robustness of our result, we perform additional estimation by changing the dependent variable. We use the tail index, of export diversification from the International Monetary Fund database in terms of, the Erfindel, the normalized Erfindel-Ishman, index from the UNCTAD. So our results are robust because the result of the estimate with the, the tail index confirmed the previous result out then, making even the variable that were not significant to significant expect the ICT services, export, which remain non-significant. The analysis of the theoretical foundation of the relationship between the trade services through the different component of export diversification led up to, to restore the empirical result to identify the dimension of trade in services that promote the export diversification. So we use the GMM and it has an estimator, and economically all our, instruments are validated according to Ansen instrument of our indexing test, and also the result obtained are corroborating, with the economic theory. So the results show that export services, export, transport, travel, insurance, financial license, creative economy, services, tourism, and promote export diversification. So based on this finding, it's important for, Sub-Saharan African countries to adopt policy and strategy to drain, the development of services sector to high-skilled services and with a strong contribution to diversification. And then it's very important for Sub-Saharan African countries to strengthen the national strategy for the development of and modernization of, of the tourism sector to make it as a lever of a manufacturing sector or a development and also of economic diversification. So we are actually at the end of the presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bouraima. That's an interesting paper on an important topic. Before I pass the floor to colleagues, would you just be able to go back to the regression results on the slides? I'm sorry, I must be getting old, but I looked at the paper itself and I couldn't. Your results are so small, I couldn't read them in the paper. So perhaps if you could just keep that up on the screen as we have our conversation about this, that would be helpful. Questions from the floor. I was actually wondering if I could invite Socrates to make some comments, because I know Socrates has worked on this same data set of services trade. Socrates, were you following this presentation?
Sorry, I was on another call. I didn't follow fully. So.
Okay, it was just Bouraima and colleagues were using this UNCTAD data set in terms of the services trade database. And I was just wondering if you'd had any observations about that, because it was quite a similar exercise to that paper that you submitted to the Journal of African Trade in that sense, although the purpose is different because they're looking at the links here with economic diversification. So look, if there's no comments from the floor, Bouraima, I was wondering if you could just take us through a couple of the results here, because you gave us a schematic presentation where you just said, you know, which were the sectors which were principally the ones that seemed to be driving economic diversification within the services subsectors. Perhaps you could just take us very quickly through that, because you've got a long list here of positive effects of 8 different,
Okay, you want me to show the table of the result? Like
yes, I mean, it's always important to have a look at this and see the consistency and try to understand. We don't have much time, but as there are no comments from the floor, perhaps you could just run us through very quickly again what you're finding on the main results there. Okay.
So this is the result. You know, we just use the export of services, dimensions. So where we have is GI, the total export, you have the transport services, and here we have like the total export of services have a positive effect. It have a negative effect of the export concentration, but it has a positive effect of export diversification. And also the transport services also as well. We have the travel, the export of travel services, but the construction services are having a positive effect upon the economic diversification, but is not significant. So the insurance service as well, this is the insurance services. The financial services has a positive effect on the export, diversification. The license services, we have the ICT services, which is not significant. The business services gathered, like, the services to enterprise and also professional services as well. But the creative active economy, such as recreational, music and this thing, they don't have like, a positive, significant effect of the export diversification. But the tourism sector has, as you can see, has a positive and significant at 10%, level of the effect on the export diversification.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I don't quite understand why there seems to be this consistently negative relationship between trade in services and total. That's kind of contradicting your findings, isn't it? That bottom row there in terms of the impact that it has on diversification.
The negative sign?
Yes.
Yes.
It's reducing the degree of concentration. I see. Is that correct? Yes. Got you. Okay. And then each of the other ones is for the subsectors. So you're looking at, so I guess ideally you'd be wanting to compare the parameter values, not only if it's significant, but actually looking at the parameter values that you're estimating here, to see, to come to some more solid conclusions. And I would just note that the parameter values are very tiny. Now that might be product of using the GMM, but I mean, if you compare the lagged value of the Hersham file, it seems that's got all the explanatory power, and the other variables are they're significant, but they're quite small parameter values, aren't they? You might want to make some comments on that. Yeah. Okay, listen, Bouraima, thank you very much for that presentation. If there's no other questions from the floor now, maybe we can have a little bit of discussion at the end again, if there's time still. Okay, Bouraima? But it's an interesting topic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I can stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. So if I now may pass the floor to the final presentation of the day, and I see Moukaila Takpara is now with us. Moukaila. Moukaila, are you with us, please?
Okay, it's fine. I am with you.
Hello. Right, Moukaila, yes, you weren't there at the beginning when we did a round of presentations. Would you like to just present yourself? The paper's entitled Trade Policy and African Participation in Global Value Chains, Does Trade Facilitation Matter? Again, a very important and topical subject. Moukaila, perhaps just say a few introductions about yourself and your co-authors.
Thank you very much. Moukaila Takpara Mouzamilou is my name. I'm a PhD candidate at the Pan-African University. I'm currently a PhD intern at the WTO.
Okay. So I'd say normally under normal circumstances, you'd have 20 minutes, but we're probably running a little bit short. So if you could possibly make the presentation in 15, I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you. Over to you. Please share your screen.
All right. Thank you. The paper I'm presenting is titled Trade Policy and African Participation in Global Value Chain, Trade Facilitation Matter. The outline of the presentation is as follows. First of all, I present background and the problem of the study, the objective of the study, the methodology used for the study, and the result obtained will follow, and then I will conclude with some policy recommendation. So in terms of background, the problem of the study, you can say over the past 2 decades, trade policy aimed at reduction tariff and non-tariff barrier and increasing integration as well as the revolution in ICT have affected production. As a result, trade, especially in intermediate goods and foreign direct investment, have increased considerably. So this development are closely linked to the emergence of global value chain. So global value chain is a concept that encompasses all the activities required to bring a good to the final consumer, from product design to distribution. So this new landscape of international trade can be an opportunity for developing countries, because global value chain include diverse activities belonging to different sectors of the economy, like primary, or secondary, or tertiary sector. So through the phenomenon of upgrading, global value chain also can contribute to the industrialization, economic transformation, and also sustainable development of countries, according to some studies carried out by UNCTAD in 2013, and also African Development Bank all in 2017. So the current literature on global value chain suggests uneven development of economic activities in the world, with increasing integration of northern countries and increasing marginalization also of those in Sub-Saharan Africa and other part of the South. So unlike Asia and particularly China, Sub-Saharan Africa has so far not been able to intercept major changes in business model, even to enter massively production network. So the participation of Sub-Saharan African countries in global value chain is still limited, mainly in low value added phases. So statistics, for example, at the global level show that between 1991 and 2012, Africa add values to only 14% of its exports, when we compare to 27% for emerging Asia, 31% for developing countries, according to studies of IMF and other authors. So regionally also, intra-African trade value added is still low, 9%, when we compare 45% in Asia and also 18% in Latin America. So within global value chain also, goods may be traded across borders multiple times as intermediate and then as final products, further amplifying also trade costs. trade facilitation is an important component of trade costs, and it's reasonable to assume that it affects countries' abilities to connect to global value chain. So the definition of trade facilitation vary across authors. We have the narrower set of the trade facilitation, which refer to the simplification and the harmonization of trade procedure. That definition is mainly what is used with the WTO, but the broader set of trade facilitation also refer to all measures that reduce trade costs other than lowering tariff, according to Schaeffer. And Portugal, Pires, and Wilson in 2012 estimated that these costs are related to hard and soft infrastructure. So in early theories of trade, international trades, goods were supposed to be produced in one place and then exported. So over the time, the new global value chain theories assume that the production of goods and services take place along a global supply chain, according to Baldwin and Pinnacle in 2013. So classical theory highlights then the role of trade costs in international trade. We refer to Ricardian model, Heckscher-Olim-Samuelson model, and in this model, for example, the existence of trade costs between two countries is a barrier to trade. So when we look at the studies empirically, we found that most of studies on trade facilitation address its effects on trade in final goods, with some example of photos that we show here, without really considering trade in intermediate or even trade in value-added goods. So even in Sub-Saharan Africa also, when we look at most studies on global value chain, they are focusing on firm and industry level case studies in selected countries, or even in different sectoral policies that can support deep and rewarding participation in global chain, including, for example, trade in natural resources, including trade in industrial goods or trade in services. So in terms of contribution, we also realize that most studies on trade policies and participation in global value chain are mainly focusing on how tariffs, as well as shifts in trade regime associated with goods, associated with regional trade agreement affect global value chain participation. So the first contribution that we use in our study is that we use the broader sets of trade facilitation to identify which indicators influences Sub-Saharan African country participation in global value chain, and thus to identify which policies to implement. This is very important that in the context of Africa, because it's not only the narrower set of trade facilitation that is important, but also the other part of trade facilitation, like quality of infrastructure and so on. So considering also the importance of trade costs in development of global value chain, I think investigating trade facilitation indicators that contribute to Sub-Saharan Africa participation in sectoral value chain provides also a useful tool for policymakers to prioritize on which sector to focus on. And also in terms of contribution, we use the instrumental variable approach, which provides consistent estimates as it solves some endogeneity problem that is common in panel data analysis. So the overall objective of our study is to analyze the contribution of trade facilitation indicators, Sub-Saharan Africa participation in global value chain during the period 2004 and 2017. So in terms of methodology, to assess country participation in global value chain, we use an econometric specification that pay particular attention to country-specific factors and also the influence of trade policies, especially trade facilitation on global value chain. And we have also that theoretically, global value chain is measured by three main measures. We have the backward integration, we have the forward integration, and also we have the total integration. So in our case, we use the foreign value added equation because in the literature it is linked with economic performance with for country. So the equation is as follows: we have FVA, which represents the foreign value added in country I in period T, which measure the share of foreign value added in the export of Sub-Saharan African countries. We have also XIT, which represents the vector of control variable like GDP, like FDI, like trade openness, like human capital also, and we have trade facilitation indicators. So trade facilitation indicators are composite indicators we constructed from 15 sub-indices using principal component analysis, and it's categorized in two, following the work of Portugal Pires, where we have hard infrastructure, which is physical infrastructure and ICT. We have also soft infrastructure, which is component with business and regulatory environment, and also border and transport efficiency. So the source of data are diverse. We have FBA, which comes from a water UNCTAD databases, XIT, the control variables that come from world development indicators, and we have also trade facilitation indicators that coming from World Economic Forum. The period of the study is 2004 and 2017. Was 25 Sub-Saharan African countries. This is dictated by the availability of data. So in terms of estimation technique, we use the baseline analysis with OLS. Then we also run the regression with two-stage square in order to take into account some endogeneity problems. So the instrument used there is the lag of variables. So to test also the quality of our model, we have three kinds of tests. We have Claiborne and PAP test for under identification. We have Crab Donald Wolf F test for weak identification. And we have also Hansen p-value test for the validity of all the instruments. I mean the lag of variables. So in terms of the result, we have, for example, 3 out of 4 trade facilitation indicators that contribute positively and significantly in terms of impacting foreign value added. Physical infrastructure, for example, contributes at 1% level, which means that a 1% improvement in the quality of roads, quality of airports, quality of port, and quality of railway infrastructure improve the upstream participation of Sub-Saharan African countries in global value chain by 0.19%. For ICT also, we found a positive effect at 10%, and also regarding borders and transport efficiency, we find a positive effect in 1% also. So to check the robustness of our result, we perform additional tests, and these analyses are carried out at the sectoral level because it's a major interest for policymakers to identify the role of trade policies in certain sectors like agriculture, textile and clothing sector, food and beverage sector. So why these kind of sectors? Because we realize, for example, that agriculture sector generates about 25% of the GDP, or 50% if we look at the broader agribusiness sector, and involve roughly 65% of the local population. So that's why we choose these 3 sectors. So in terms of the results, for example, we have physical infrastructure, ICT, and business environment, which contribute positively to upstream integration in agriculture and food, textile and clothing sector. Regarding food and beverage also, we find border efficiency ICT, physical infrastructure also have positive effects on FPVA in this sector. So to conclude, can say our results reveal that trade facilitation indicators such as physical infrastructure, ICT, and borders and transport efficiency contribute positively to the absent participation of countries in global value chain, and these results are even more interesting at the sectoral level. In terms of policy implication of our results, we realize that border and transport efficiency plays an important role in the participation of Sub-Saharan Africa countries in global value chain. And considering that the WTO trade facilitation agreement fundamentally addresses the soft aspect of infrastructure, so countries in Sub-Saharan Africa need to accelerate, for example, its implementation to benefit from the facilities offered by this agreement. Also, we found that countries in Sub-Saharan Africa need to continue to improve their performance in physical and ICT infrastructure. Physical infrastructure is really an area that has long required attention in Sub-Saharan Africa, and this study underscores its increased importance in the area of global value chain. And third, which is more encouragingly, is that improving hard and soft infrastructure is a way for Sub-Saharan Africa countries to better connect to global value chain at the sectoral level. So this calls for well-targeted sectoral policies to reap the benefits of a global value chain. I thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Moukaila. That's an interesting contribution as well to this discussion on an Africa trade. Colleagues, does anybody from the floor have any questions? Because I have a few initial observations, if not. Okay, Moukaila,
yeah.
Let me go ahead with a couple of comments then. My first was actually the justification there. You said trade facilitation its impact hasn't been studied so much on intermediate goods. It's been focused on final goods. But why do you suppose that trade facilitation measures would have any differential impact between final goods and intermediate inputs? Surely the transport infrastructure that's being impacted here works for both. So I just wanted a bit of a clarification about that justification. And then secondly, I'd just like to go back to your regression results. I guess if you wouldn't mind just sharing the slide again where you show the two-stage least square results for foreign value added.
Yeah.
Yes, the actual table, the actual econometric, the full results there.
The full result. I have to change the.
You have it in the paper. You did show it,
have.
didn't you, briefly? I think in your presentation, you did actually show the full results.
Let me share the table.
I'm not sure which slide that was.
Yeah.
Just again, because I had a couple of questions.
All right.
Oh, you've gone.
I want to open the paper.
I mean, my question was actually going to be about the economic significance of some of the variables. I'm always a little bit suspicious of two sets of results. One where you get very little, which is actually significant in the regression, and one where there's a lot of the variables which are simultaneously significant. Now, if you can go back to that slide where you showed the results, you're not sharing the screen again, I think. Moukaila.
It's okay.
Right, go down your screens, your slides.
Yeah.
Did you not show the regression results themselves? I thought you did.
No, I did not.
You didn't. You just showed the final results. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, the issue is actually on page 19 of your actual paper, you've got, for example, a negative result between foreign direct investment and the share of foreign value added.
Yeah.
How would you explain that? Also, government effectiveness also seems to be negative.
Yeah.
I struggle to understand the economic meaning. You understand of some of the other control variables that you're using in the regressions. Perhaps you could just expand on that.
Okay. So regarding the governance effectiveness is negative, and it is the contrast because the theory said it's supposed to be positive. So my explanation, I think, is that when we look at the details on the governance effectiveness indicators, African countries, those in the sample, have low score. So I think the score is not able at the stage to influence really positively the integration, the African integration into global value chain. So that is what I got.
Okay.
But I mean, normally it's supposed to be positive. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the same with the FDI figure. You would imagine that the degree of foreign value added, if you've got more foreign direct investment, it would probably increase that unless, I mean, you're doing the actual log of foreign value added, not the share, no? Because the converse of the foreign value added share is, of course, the domestic value added. So I'm just wondering for a few reflections on that in your results, because you've got clearly quite consistent and logical results. The tariff, for example, the higher the tariff, the lower the share of foreign value added, which makes complete sense, does it not? Yes, I mean, I'm just wondering what would happen if you ran the same regressions on the domestic value added and see whether the coefficients flip.
Yes, yeah, I did not regress the domestic value added because most studies have already highlighted that African participate really in global value chain, but at the low stage, which is the domestic value added. So we, in that paper, we consider that the foreign value added is more benefit for countries than domestic value added. So we focus really on the FBA rather than running and see if what will be the result for DVA, for example.
Moukaila, if I could just be the devil's advocate on that, though. I mean, if we're saying genuinely the foreign value added has a greater value than domestic value added, there's a strange thing going on in the discourse currently, in the sense that, you know, we've always talked about the enclave nature of a lot of foreign direct investment, the fact there's not enough linkages, and the fact that domestic value added is very low. But with this kind of literature, when we start looking at value chains, we start to say, no, on the contrary, high levels of foreign value added are a good thing, not high levels of domestic value added. And I'd wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on that apparent contradiction, because it's something I struggle with when I look at these studies as well. You know, governments are constantly being asked to look to ways to increase the share of domestic value added of investments. And yet with this literature that we have on global value chains, the share of foreign value added seems to be what we're pursuing. So I wonder if you could just reflect on that, because I struggle in my own mind to reconcile the two strands of literature there.
Okay.
if you can't answer it now, Moukaila, it's not a problem. It's just food for thought, perhaps, for the papers, because we struggled with the same idea. We did a fairly similar exercise for our paper that we'll be presenting on Friday. And, you know, we were discussing this, exactly the economic significance of it. I mean, I do remember a paper by David Dollar where he was suggesting that, you know, countries trying to retain domestic value added can actually be counterproductive in terms of attracting global value chains. And I think he gave the example of Bangladesh and its textile sector. You know, the fact that they're not insisting on double or triple transformation, that they actually import all the fabrics and they just make the garments. And that if they'd been trying to retain more domestic value added, those industries might not have been competitive globally. So I suppose that's one of the conclusions that we can get out of this literature. But if you take it to an extreme, it kind of conflicts with the policy advice that many governments across the continent get about, you know, focusing on raising domestic value added. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that, or if not, if any of the other participants have any observations, particularly on this theme, as we've also had other papers on global value chains as well here. No, if not, if there are no, I see there's one question in the or comment in the chat. No, just somebody saying hello. There was a question, I don't know, Moukaila, or if Socrates is still online, that we could answer. This was a question addressed to Socrates' paper, but because he's using the same database, he says, could you, it's from Privilege. He says, could you tell me why you chose the EORA database specifically?
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Why EORA data? Because when we look at the data in value added, we have data from OECD, which do not really cover most African countries. So we find the EORA data most coverage in terms of coverage, cover many African countries, and also in terms of long period, it's we find it better to use EORA data. That's why we use that data.
Yes, I mean, I think for all of us that are researching African trade, we generally have a temptation to use the databases which are most comprehensive for our continent, don't we? But I believe there's some problems with that approach sometimes, though, simply because of the reliability of that data. So in one of the earlier presentations, I was just pointing to the rather suspiciously stable numbers that we get from the UNCTAD EORA data set, you know, in terms of foreign value added and domestic value added. The trends look just too stable, and it's partly possibly because a lot of the data is imputed. Now, that does apply actually to the previous paper as well by Sawadogo and colleagues in the services, because UNCTAD has a nice data set there, which is, you know, it's the only data set where we can actually identify subcategories of services trade. However, when you look at the amounts in some of those sectors, the data set doesn't seem very consistent when you start looking at the holes in the data. And I think it's probably because the central banks aren't necessarily providing the necessary breakdown sometimes. So I think we all confront this challenge, don't we, of the quality of the data sets that we're dealing with, and we tend to end up using what is available, but that doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, the quality of the data, that the underlying quality. And some of our results in our econometric analysis might be driven by some of those inconsistencies that we detect. I don't know, food for thought for colleagues. If there's no further observations. Yes, please do. Yeah, please come in.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to come back on the data issue from UNCTAD. like especially, about like the data on services and African countries. So most of the time it's very difficult for us to have like the data on trade services, except from, UNTAD. Even from my paper, I was like, obliged to combine two sets of data from UNTAD, from the manual of, balance of payment, 6th edition, and of manual of payment, balance of payment, the 5th edition. So coming to what you just, arise of, the accuracy of some data, and what would be like, according to you, the solution for us, or maybe some kind of advice to have like accuracy data from, especially based on African countries?
Yes, I don't have an answer to that, Bouraima. I think we need to exercise some caution, at least, and put the necessary caveats in our conclusions when we're looking at the analysis. And we also need to be careful about sometimes just capturing things that are repeated in the literature, but may not necessarily be true, or fully true, or genuinely reflect what's going on the continent. So, for example, in the earlier paper by David on ECOWAS trade, he cited the data, but talking about comparisons of intracontinental trade with other regional blocks. And some of those comparisons, as I've made in a short piece I did for Brookings Institute, are misleading because we're not comparing like with like. There was one thing you said in Bouraima, in your services trade paper, actually, which was about the dynamism in services trade. And certainly we get that feeling in East Africa as well. It's a relatively dynamic component until the COVID crisis hit. However, there was one statement you made, that wasn't quite true. I mean, I remember Hajun Chang in one of his articles just noticing that actually services trade as a share of global trade has stayed fairly consistently at around 20%. For quite a few decades. It hasn't shifted a lot, which suggests that maybe people are overplaying sometimes, the extent to which services trade can be transformative. That doesn't mean we need to ignore its economic significance, but there are reasons why it doesn't tend to go beyond that 20% figure, and it's structural, and it's the fact that some services are tradable, but a lot of them aren't. And a lot of African countries are focused actually in sectors which are non-tradable and not particularly high value added services either. So I think we all need to treat our data sources and the received messages that we're getting from other studies a little bit cautiously when it deals with the African continent, particularly when it contrasts with what we know from our daily experiences, the reality of, regional trade. Yeah, I don't know whether that resonates with colleagues undertaking study on the continent as well, these issues.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's really clear now.
Yeah. Okay, colleagues, well, if there's no further questions or interventions from the floor, David, you wish to intervene?
No, I just wanted to agree with you that, yeah, we need to be very, I think a lot of times especially when we're trying to present at, say, international conferences, we tend to put our local knowledge aside and then just focus on the numbers and the numbers alone, but sometimes that doesn't tell the full story. And we need to take some of the local know-how into consideration when we interpret some of the results we see. So yeah, I'm agreeing with you in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, on that note of agreement at the end, just like to thank all the presenters. You have an interesting set of papers here. I hope some of the comments are helpful in revising the papers, and we're all successful in getting our papers finally published. With that, Romain, do I pass back the floor to you?
Yeah, if we're done, then I'll just add my thanks to everyone, especially for your staying on time, and thank you, Andrew, for managing our sessions so well. I'll be closing out this room, so you can go back to your conference agenda and look for where you want to be in the next concurrent session round. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.